Gone. The dragon enclave of Veltharion had not known panic in 300 years. The last time fear had moved through the enclave like a living thing spreading from nest to nest, from elder to elder, curling into the deep caverns where the oldest dragons slept their long seasonal sleeps, had been during the Sundering Wars, when human armies had marched with iron-tipped siege weapons and the audacity of species that had not yet learned what dragon fire truly cost. That panic had been sharp and immediate, the kind that burned clean and resolved itself in battle. The elders who remembered it described it sometimes in the measured way that very old creatures describe very old pain as almost clarifying. There had been an enemy. There had been a direction to face. This was different. Elder Sarith, a copper-scaled matriarch whose wingspan could blot out the morning sun, and whose eyes had watched 2 centuries of seasons turn over the mountain peaks of Veltharion, had raised 4 clutches of hatchlings. She knew them the way a stone knows the shape of the water that has run over it for 1,000 years, completely, unconsciously, in a way that required no thought because it had become part of her own structure. She knew the difference between a hatchling that had wandered off for an afternoon and a hatchling that was asterisk gone. The difference was not logical. It was not something she could have explained to a younger dragon in terms they could write down and study. It was a quality of absence, a particular texture to the silence of an empty nest that was distinct from the silence of a nest whose occupant had simply stepped out. The moment she counted only empty nests where 7 small bodies should have been curled together in sleep. 7, all of them, not 1 or 2 but all 7, which no ordinary afternoon wandering could account for. She knew this was the latter. She stood at the entrance to the hatchling cavern for a long time before she called for anyone. The cavern was deep in the enclave's interior, warmed by thermal vents in the rock below, its walls worn smooth by generations of hatchlings who had rubbed their growing scales against the stone to ease the itching of new growth. Nesting material was still arranged in the shallow depressions where the 7 slept: dried grasses, soft moss, the shed feathers of mountain birds that the hatchlings had collected with the enthusiastic and indiscriminate acquisitiveness that very young dragons applied to anything that caught their interest. The nests looked asterisk slept in. They looked like nests whose occupants had simply stood up and walked away not long ago, not in distress. That was, in its own way, the most troubling thing. There were no signs of struggle. No scorched stone, no claw marks, no evidence of the kind of desperate defensive fire that even very young hatchlings could produce when sufficiently frightened. Whatever had happened, the 7 had not been afraid when it happened. They had simply left. Or been taken by something they had not recognized as a threat. Sarith did not allow herself to follow that thought to its conclusion. She turned from the cavern and went to find Elder Voss. The search began at dawn the following morning, though Sarith had not slept in the hours between. She had spent them walking the perimeter of the enclave's outer ledges, checking every overhang and crevice large enough to shelter a hatchling, calling in the low subsonic frequency that dragons used for close-range family communication, a frequency that carried through stone and could be felt in the chest before it was heard with the ears. She received no response. The mountain absorbed her calls and gave nothing back. By the time the sun crested the eastern peaks, she had 30 dragons in coordinated formation, sweeping the mountain ranges in overlapping grid patterns, their thermal vision cutting through the morning fog that pooled in the valleys below. Dragon Thermal Sight was among the most precise sensory tools in the known world. It could distinguish the heat signature of a hatchling from that of a similarly sized animal at distances that would have made the distinction invisible to any other species. If the 7 were in the mountains, alive and generating heat, they would be found within hours. The first day produced nothing. Riders from the Conclave of Wings, the Order of Human Dragon-paired scouts who maintained the formal boundaries between Enclave territory and the wider world, were dispatched to every neighboring territory with descriptions of the 7 and standing orders to report any sighting immediately. The Conclave riders were efficient and well-connected. They had relay stations throughout the mountain passes and into the upper valleys, and a message sent through their network could reach the furthest outpost in a day and a half. Sarith sent 6 separate riders in 6 separate directions and told them all the same thing: find them and send word before you do anything else. The scrying pools were consulted next. The Enclave maintained 3 ancient things, older than any living dragon, their surfaces permanently attuned to the resonance of Veltharion's bloodline. In theory, a hatchling of the Enclave's clutches could be located through the pools so long as they lived and breathed within 1,000 leagues. In practice, scrying pools were temperamental, prone to showing what had been rather than what was, and deeply unhelpful when the subject of the scrying was very young, and had not yet developed the kind of distinct magical signature that made adult dragons easy to find. The pools showed Sarith the hatchling cavern as it had looked 3 mornings ago. They showed her crest, the copper-scaled, anxious one, investigating a loose stone near the cavern's secondary entrance with the intense focus that young dragons applied to anything that might potentially be interesting. They showed her Ember sleeping in a shaft of afternoon light, her red-gold scales catching the warmth with the contentment of a creature completely at home. They showed her over and over the enclave as it had been before. They did not show her where the seven were now. Ancient tracking spells were cast next, the kind that cost a dragon 3 scales and a year of sleep to cast, the kind that were kept in reserve for genuine emergencies and spoken of in the enclave's historical records with the solemnity accorded to weapons of last resort. 3 of the elder dragons submitted to the casting voluntarily, without being asked. Sarith watched them pull the scales from their own flanks with the controlled grimace of creatures accustomed to pain, watched the spells take shape in the cold mountain air, watched the tracking threads extend outward in every direction like the roots of an invisible tree reaching into the world. The threads went still, they found nothing to attach to. Which meant the Enclave's most senior spellworker explained carefully, either that the hatchlings were beyond the spell's considerable range, or that something was actively interfering with the tracking, or that the hatchlings were. She paused here, and Sarith watched her choose her words with the precision of someone who understood that some sentences, once said, could not be unsaid, no longer producing the kind of resonant magical signature that living creatures produced. Sarith said nothing in response to this. She simply walked back to the hatchling cavern, sat at its entrance, and stayed there until the sun went down. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The search did not stop. Sarith would not allow it to stop, and even if she had, the enclave would have continued without her authorization, because these were their hatchlings, the youngest members of their community, the 7 who had hatched to considerable celebration 8 months ago and had spent those 8 months systematically dismantling the dignity of every adult dragon in the enclave with the cheerful destructiveness of the very young. Ember had figured out how to open the storage cavern where the enclave kept its more delicate historical documents and had apparently eaten 2 of them before anyone noticed. Crest had developed an alarming habit of climbing the tallest available surface, cliff face, elder dragon, ceremonial archway, and sitting at the top looking profoundly satisfied with himself. The blue-gray one who had no formal name yet, because the nomming ceremony happened at 1 year old and none of them had reached it, breathed a concentrated jet of cold air instead of fire, and had discovered that this was particularly effective for startling sleeping adults out of their afternoon rest. The enclave missed them with a fierceness that surprised even the older dragons, who had thought themselves past the age of being surprised by the depth of attachment. The hatchling cavern was left exactly as it was. No one spoke about reorganizing the nesting material or repurposing the space. The adults who had previously complained about the noise and chaos of having 7 young dragons underfoot found themselves stopping in the middle of unrelated tasks, struck by the specific quality of quiet that had replaced the noise, and finding it significantly less preferable than they had expected. The enclave grew quiet in the way that only grief can make a place quiet, not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, but a heavy and airless stillness that settled over stone and bone alike and made even the thermal winds feel muted, as though the mountain itself was holding its breath. Sarith stopped eating at the end of the 3rd week. She told no one, she simply found that she had no appetite and that the effort of manufacturing one exceeded what she could currently spare. She continued to lead the search coordination, continued to review the daily reports from the Conclave writers, continued to consult with the spellworkers about alternative tracking methodologies. She did all of this with the careful, contained efficiency of a dragon who had governed for 2 centuries and knew how to function through things that would have destroyed a younger creature. But she stopped eating, and she did not sleep well, and the copper of her scales lost some of their luster in the way that dragon scales did when their owner was under sustained stress. The other elders noticed. They began speaking to her in the careful, cushioned tones that people use when they are constructing emotional scaffolding around someone, supporting without crowding, present without intruding, preparing the ground for a conversation that no one wanted to initiate. Sarith recognized what they were doing because she had done it herself more than once in 200 years of living. She recognized it, and she did not tell them to stop because she was not certain they were wrong. She simply was not ready to have the conversation they were preparing her for. It was Elder Voss who eventually broke the particular silence that had settled over the enclave's daily councils. Voss was the oldest living dragon in Veltharion, old enough that the gray of his muzzle extended now in a frost-like wash across the sides of his face and down his neck, old enough that his wings carried the slight translucency of extreme age, through which the light passed in pale blues and silvers. He was a storm dragon by lineage, which meant that in his prime he had been able to call lightning from a clear sky and had once, according to Enclave records, grounded an entire fleet of war vessels during a coastal conflict 3 centuries ago by generating a localized storm system over a period of 6 days. He was not by temperament a particularly emotional creature. The storm dragon bloodlines tended toward the analytical. They planned. They calculated. They arrived at conclusions through logic rather than intuition, and they delivered those conclusions without decoration. He waited until the seventh council meeting, the seventh consecutive meeting in which the assembled elders had reviewed the search reports, confirmed that nothing new had been found, and then sat in uncomfortable silence for a period that grew longer each time before someone found the will to formally close the session. Then he said, without preamble, that they should widen the search to the human settlements below the mountain passes. The silence that followed this suggestion was of a different quality than the grief silence that had pervaded the enclave for weeks. This was the silence of a room full of individuals who had all had the same thought at some point, and had all, individually, decided not to say it aloud. Dragons did not, as a rule, go looking for things in human towns. This was not hostility. The formal hostility of the Sundering Wars had been resolved, more or less, through a series of treaties that Sareth herself had been involved in negotiating, and the current relationship between Veltharion and the human settlements in the Valley territories was one of cautious mutual respect. The Conclave of Wings existed precisely to manage the interface between the two worlds, and it did so with reasonable effectiveness. But the towns themselves were another matter. The scale was wrong. For one thing, a dragon of any significant age was simply too large for the spaces that humans built, and navigating a human settlement required a constant, attention-consuming management of one's own size that dragons found exhausting and undignified. The noise was wrong too. A relentless layering of sound, iron on iron, wheels on stone, voices, animals, the particular mechanical clatter of the devices that humans had been building with increasing complexity over the past several decades, that interfered with the precise sensory discrimination dragons relied on, and the smell. Dragons had extraordinarily sensitive olfactory systems, calibrated over millennia for the clean cold air of mountain altitudes, and human towns smelled of things that required significant mental effort to process without being overwhelmed. Coal smoke and cooking grease and animal waste, and the sharp chemical bite of the oils and fuels that seemed to be everywhere in human settlements now, as the machines multiplied. The Enclave's general policy, unstated but universally understood, was that they sent human liaisons on their behalf when human settlements needed to be dealt with. They did not go themselves. Voss had clearly anticipated the silence. He let it run its course, and then he laid out his reasoning with the unhurried precision of someone who had thought this through carefully and was now presenting conclusions rather than arguments. The mountain ranges had been searched thoroughly, more thoroughly, he said, than any search in the Enclave's history, by more dragons using more resources over a longer period of time. The Conclave riders had reached every territory within the known range of a hatchling capable of sustained independent flight, which for 8-month-olds was limited but not negligible. The scrying pools and tracking spells had both failed, which suggested either extraordinary range or extraordinary interference, neither of which was consistent with a simple wandering scenario. What had not been thoroughly searched, he said, was the territory below the passes. Not because anyone had decided it was unimportant, but because the unexamined assumption that they had all been operating under without quite articulating it was that hatchlings would not go down. That down was the wrong direction. That 8-month-old dragons, even uncommonly curious and adventurous ones, would not have found their way through the mountain passes and into the valley territories below. He paused here and looked around the table, and then he asked whether any of them had actually considered how Crest had managed to open a sealed historical archive when he was 4 months old, and whether a hatchling capable of that might not also be capable of navigating a mountain pass. The silence after this was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. Sareth had been sitting very still throughout Voss's presentation, as she had been sitting very still throughout most things for the past several weeks. She had her eyes on the middle distance, in the way she did when she was processing something not absent exactly but turned inward. The other elders watched her carefully. They knew that whatever happened next would follow from what she decided in the next few moments. She thought about Crest at the top of the ceremonial archway, tail wrapped around the uppermost stone, looking out at the mountains with an expression that she had categorized at the time as juvenile showing off, but that she could see now with the clarity of retrospect had been something else. Hunger. Not for food, but for the thing beyond the thing, for the next ridge, the next valley, the next unknown arrangement of the world. She thought about Ember, who had eaten historical documents. Not because she was hungry, but because she wanted to know what was in them, and eating was, for a very young dragon, a perfectly reasonable alternative to reading. She thought about the one who breathed cold air and had no name yet, and how she had caught that one twice, standing at the outer ledge of the enclave at dusk, looking down into the valley territories with an intensity that Sareth had found oddly moving without quite knowing why. She had been searching the mountains. She had been searching where adult dragons would have gone, where the logic of the territory suggested they should be, where the established patterns of hatchling behavior pointed. She had not been searching where 7 small, intensely curious, apparently fearless creatures who ate historical documents and climbed ceremonial archways and breathed cold air, and had probably decided, collectively or individually, that the world was larger than the enclave's perimeter. She had not been searching where they would have actually gone. She looked at Voss. Yes, she said. Just the one word, but the quality of it was different from anything she had said in 4 weeks, less careful, less contained, carrying under it something that the other elders recognized with a collective and unspoken relief as something adjacent to hope. Not certainty, not even confidence, but the particular energy of someone who has been facing the wrong direction and has finally, at considerable cost, turned around. The council was closed. The preparations for descent began before the sun had moved another hand's breadth across the sky. Sarith went back to the hatchling cavern one more time before she left. She stood at the entrance and looked at the 7 empty nests with their arranged moss and mountain bird feathers, and she allowed herself to think clearly and without the protective blurring she had been applying to the thought for 4 weeks, that the 7 were somewhere in the world below, that they had gone there on purpose, that they had to be still curious, still hungry, still looking out at the next ridge and the one after that. She was going to find them. She went down. The mechanic. Darrow Finch had been a mechanic for going on 30 years, and in that time he had developed a comprehensive and practical philosophy about problems. The philosophy was not complicated. It did not require writing down. It had no formal name, and Darrow had never articulated it to anyone, partly because he was not by nature an articulate man, and partly because it seemed self-evident to the point of not requiring articulation. The philosophy was simply this: everything that was broken had a reason it was broken, and if you could find the reason, you could generally find the fix. And if you could find the fix, there was no particular value in spending time on how you felt about the fact that the thing had been broken in the first place. This approach had served him well across 3 decades of professional work that had encompassed, in rough chronological order, combined harvesters of every make and vintage produced in the Valley territories in the last 40 years, cargo haulers ranging from the small single-axle variety to the enormous 12-wheel freight behemoths that the trading companies ran between the mountain passes and the coastal ports. 2 river barges whose owners had been told by every other mechanic in a 100-mile radius that the damage was irreparable, and who had come to Darrow as a last resort with the resigned expressions of people who expected to be disappointed again. 1 very confused steam organ that a traveling entertainer had driven into a ditch during a rainstorm, and which had subsequently produced only a sound like a large animal in moderate distress, until Darrow spent 4 hours with it and a set of very fine tools, and a mechanical leg for the blacksmith's daughter 3 villages over, which had been the most technically demanding job of his career, and which he was, if he was honest, quietly prouder of than almost anything else he had made. He was not a complicated man. He had no family locally, a sister in the coastal city, a nephew he saw at midsummer festival if the roads were good, and he had never found this a source of particular distress. He woke early in the gray pre-dawn when the light was still undecided, and began work before most of the village had finished deciding whether to get up. He worked through the day with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had long since stopped needing to think consciously about most of what he was doing, his hands moving through familiar sequences while his mind occupied itself with the specific problem in front of him. He ate whatever was in the pot, which was whatever he had put in the pot the previous evening, which was usually something simple and filling, and almost certainly the same thing he had eaten 2 or 3 days previously, because varying one's meals required a kind of planning attention that Darrow preferred to direct elsewhere. He slept hard and dreamlessly on the cot he kept in the back corner of his shop, behind the secondary parts shelf and next to the small iron stove that he kept burning low through the cold months, because walking home through the dark streets to his actual house had never seemed worth the effort when the cot was right there and the shop was already warm. His customers regarded him with the particular respect that competent tradespeople earn in small communities, the respect that is partly professional and partly something more like relief, the comfort of knowing that there is someone who can fix the things that break, that the world is not entirely at the mercy of entropy. They did not, for the most part, try to have conversations with him beyond what was necessary for the job at hand. Darrow did not encourage it, not out of unfriendliness but out of a deep preference for the clean economy of functional exchange. You described the problem. He told you when it would be ready and what it would cost. He fixed it. You paid. The interaction had a satisfying completeness to it that Darrow found deeply preferable to the sprawling, unresolved quality of most social conversation. He had not intended to adopt 7 dragon hatchlings. It had started, as most things in Darrow's life started, with a problem that needed fixing. The problem initially had appeared to be a small, iridescent green creature approximately the size of a house cat, wedged firmly behind his secondary parts shelf in a gap that Darrow had not previously known existed, and which now that he knew about it he could see had clearly been used as a passage of some kind. The dust disturbed, the edges of the gap worn smooth in a way that suggested repeated transit. The creature was shivering in the particular rapid, fine-grained way that small things shiver when they are very cold and have been cold for some time. It was also thin in a way that was visible even through the iridescent green scales, the outline of its ribs and the prominent jut of its hip bones suggesting that it had not eaten well in a while. It looked up at him with amber eyes that were considerably more alert and evaluating than he would have expected from something in its condition, and made a sound that was somewhere between a chirp and a hiss, not aggressive, he judged, but warning. Establishing terms. Darrow looked at it for a moment. He had in 30 years of rural trade work encountered most of the animals common to the valley territories in various states of need, and he had a working practical knowledge of what most of them required. This was not any animal he had encountered before. The scales were unusual, the eyes were unusual, the wings small and folded tight against its body but unmistakably wings were unusual. He went to his cold storage, found the remnants of the smoked pork he'd been working through for the past several days, cut a reasonable portion and put it on the floor near the gap without getting close enough to crowd the creature. Then he went to his cot and went to sleep because it was late and there was a hauler coming in first thing in the morning with a transmission problem and he needed to be rested for it. He'd assumed it was some manner of large lizard. He'd fed it scraps of smoked pork and gone to bed. By morning there were 3 of them. The additional 2 were less hidden than the first. One was sitting openly on top of the secondary parts shelf when Darrow came in, watching him with the same alert, evaluating amber stare, and one was behind the forge, pressed against the warm stone of its base with the focused appreciation of a creature that had found exactly what it was looking for in terms of heat. This one was the red-gold color of banked coals, and when Darrow approached to look at it more closely, it opened its mouth and produced a small, controlled tongue of fire that served, he judged, the same communicative purpose as the first one's hiss. Not attack, warning terms. He fed them all. He noted that the one from the previous night had eaten the smoked pork and appeared to have moved from the gap behind the shelf to the top of the engine casing near the stove, where it was now sleeping in a tight coil with its tail wrapped around itself. It looked, he thought, significantly less thin than it had the night before, which either meant it had eaten very efficiently or that whatever it was, it metabolized food with a speed that was not consistent with any animal he knew. He went about his day. The transmission problem turned out to be exactly what the owner had described, which was unusual. Most people described their mechanical problems in terms of the symptoms they produced rather than the actual failure, which was understandable but meant that diagnosis was usually a separate step from repair. This man had correctly identified the specific gear that was slipping, which saved Darrow approximately 2 hours and put him in a good mood for the rest of the morning. He fixed the transmission, charged a fair price, and was eating his midday meal when he became aware that all 3 of the small creatures were sitting in a loose semicircle approximately 4 feet from him, watching the food with an intensity that was not quite demanding but was definitely communicative. He divided what he had and gave each of them a portion. This was, he recognized even at the time, a decision with consequences. But they were thin, all 3 of them, and hungry in the direct and undisguised way that creatures are hungry when they have been going without for long enough that they have lost the energy to pretend otherwise, and Darrow had never been able to watch something go hungry when he had food to spare. By the end of the week, all 7 had materialized. They came in 1s and 2s from whatever cracks and shadows they had been occupying, not just in the shop, but apparently in the spaces between the shop and the neighboring buildings. In the gap under the rear foundation behind the wood storage, in the ceiling space above the secondary work area where there was a section of loose board that Darrow had been meaning to fix for 2 years and now understood had been fixed in its own way by being used as an entrance. He had not known that any of them were there. Looking back, he recognized signs he had not read at the time, small disturbances in the dust, the faint smell of something warm and slightly sulfurous that he had attributed to the forge, a sound in the walls on the 3rd night that he had put down to mice. They had, it was clear, been watching him for some time before they decided to reveal themselves. They had been assessing, deciding whether the warmth and the food and the particular quality of silence that a working shop has after hours, purposeful, unhurried, safe, the silence of a place that has a reason for existing and is at peace with that reason, were worth the risk of being seen. He asked around the village whether anyone had lost a clutch of unusual lizards. He described them as accurately as he could, which produced some interesting expressions from people who were clearly trying to decide whether Darrow had finally spent too many years alone with his engines. Nobody had claimed them. So Darrow had done what Darrow did with every problem that came into his shop. He assessed what was actually in front of him, identified what it needed, and adapted. The sleeping platform came first. because the floor was cold and stone-flagged and clearly inadequate for creatures that were demonstrably seeking warmth as a priority. He built it from an old engine casing, a large flat-topped unit from a decommissioned freight hauler that had been sitting in his yard for 2 years waiting to be useful, elevated on 4 sections of pipe to bring it up off the floor and positioned near the stove but not so near as to create a fire risk. He lined it with the heavy canvas he used for covering work, folded several layers thick. The seven investigated it with the thorough, slightly suspicious attention that they applied to all new things, and by the second night were using it without apparent reservation. He adjusted the scrap pile next, because it was a hazard. He kept scrap in a loose heap in the northeastern corner, metal offcuts, broken components, worn gears, all the accumulated detritus of 30 years of repair work that might someday be useful for something. And in its previous configuration it had edges and points that were acceptable when the only things moving through the shop were humans who knew to be careful around it. Small creatures who moved fast and did not always look where they were going were a different matter. He spent an afternoon reorganizing it into stable stacks with the sharper elements inside and the blunt ones out, which was something he had been meaning to do for years anyway. The fire situation required more careful management. He had discovered on the fourth day that not all seven breathed fire. This discovery had occurred when he was working under a hauler and became aware of a sudden intense warmth near his left ankle, turned to investigate, and found the red gold one, Ember, as he would eventually name her, standing approximately 8 inches from his boot with a focused and experimental expression, producing a thin stream of fire aimed at, as far as he could tell, a bolt that had become stuck through rust and cold. She was not, he gradually understood, trying to burn him. She was trying to help. She had been watching him work long enough to understand that stuck bolts were a problem and that heat was a solution, and she had made the logical extension. He thanked her, meaning it, and directed her flame more precisely with a gesture and a word. The bolt came loose in under a minute. Ember looked extraordinarily pleased with herself. After that, through a series of incidents that included 2 singed eyebrows, one genuinely alarming moment involving a fuel canister that he did not examine too closely in retrospect, and 3 weeks of careful observation, he arrived at a reasonably accurate map of which of the 7 breathed fire, which breathed other things, and how much control each of them currently had over whatever they were producing. The answer to the control question was variable, improving, and heavily influenced by attention and interest. When they were engaged, they were precise. When they were bored or startled or playing, they were not. The slate blue one breathed cold air. Not just cool air, a concentrated directional jet of genuinely cold air that dropped the temperature of whatever it touched by a significant margin in a very short time. Darrow had discovered this when the slate blue one, apparently deciding that the steam rising from a cooling engine was interesting and should be investigated directly, directed a burst of cold air at the engine and caused the steam to condense instantly into a cloud of fine water droplets that hung in the shop air for a remarkable amount of time. He had stood there for a moment watching the droplets catch the morning light, and then he had thought about how often he needed to cool engine parts quickly and how long it currently took using the water trough. And he had looked at the slate blue one with the expression he got when a tool turned out to have an application he hadn't anticipated. He named that one Bellows. He named all of them eventually. It seemed rude not to. The nomming had not been a planned process. It had happened incrementally, the way most things in Darrow's life happened, through the accumulation of observation and the natural tendency of the human mind to attach language to patterns once the patterns become familiar enough. Ember was first for the obvious reason. Then Bellows, the copper-scaled one who climbed everything, every surface in the shop, regardless of whether it was designed for climbing, with a focus and commitment that suggested this was not casual behavior but intentional practice, he named Crest, because it was always trying to reach the top of things. The small green one, the first one he'd found, he named Nettle, partly for the color and partly because it had a sharpness to it not mean but precise, quick to react, unwilling to be handled without its explicit consent. The two that were almost impossible to tell apart at first glance, both a warm gray-brown, both approximately the same size, both possessed of an eerie synchronicity of movement that suggested some form of communication he couldn't perceive. He named Rivet and Clasp, which felt right in a way he couldn't entirely explain but didn't feel the need to. The seventh, the largest of them by a small margin, deep blue-black with scales that had a faint iridescence in certain lights, he named Forge. Forge was the one he had the most complicated relationship with, in the sense that Forge appeared to have decided very early on that Darrow's judgment was sound and worth deferring to, and expressed this through a kind of constant, calm proximity that was not quite protective but was definitely deliberate. Wherever Darrow worked, Forge was nearby, not underfoot, not in the way, but present in the alert, settled manner of something that has assigned itself a post and intends to keep it. When customers came in who were unfamiliar or loud, or who moved with the sudden unpredictability that startled the smaller hatchlings. It was Forge who positioned between them and the others, not aggressively, but with the quiet solidity of a door that happened to be alive. Darrow found this on reflection more touching than he had words for. They followed him through the shop during the day, climbing over engines and draping themselves across tool chests, and settling into whatever patch of warmth they could find near the stove, on top of running machinery. In the shaft of morning light that came through the high east window and tracked across the floor over the course of the morning in a stripe that each of them used in turn as it moved. They watched him work with the particular attention of creatures who were genuinely trying to understand what he was doing and why. And over the weeks he had watched them go from watching to occasionally touching, a tentative paw on a component he had set aside, a careful sniff at a tool he had just put down, Ember's increasingly accurate and useful assistance with stuck hardware. Customers raised eyebrows. One woman backed out of the shop and came back in twice before she stayed, and even then kept her eyes moving in the anxious way of someone cataloging exits. A farmer who brought in a cultivator blade refused to enter until Darrow had, in his words, secured the animals, which Darrow interpreted as moving them off the cultivator, where 4 of them were perched and examining the blade with professional interest, and onto the sleeping platform, where they conveyed their opinion of this request through the medium of pointed stillness. Mostly, though, people looked, said nothing directly, and handed over their invoices with the resigned pragmatism of rural people who had learned that Darrow Finch was the only mechanic within 40 miles who could fix certain things, and that the things in his shop were therefore something to be accepted as a condition of service. At night, when the shop quieted and the work was done and the stove was banked low for sleeping, the hatchlings piled onto his cot. This had not been planned either. The sleeping platform was there, was warm, was adequately sized for 7 hatchlings with room to spare. There was no logical reason for them to be on his cot. Darrow had, the first time it happened, attempted to return them to the platform, which had resulted in a 20-minute project of diminishing returns as each hatchling he moved was replaced by one he hadn't noticed moving. And eventually he had found himself lying on the cot entirely surrounded, with Bellow's snout tucked under his chin and Ember distributed across his sternum in the flat, 4-legs-out posture that she adopted when she was completely at ease. And Forge settled against his right side with the settled, weight-bearing permanence of a sandbag, and he had simply stopped moving them and gone to sleep. They were heavier than they looked, which was considerable because they looked substantial to begin with, but they were warm, genuinely, radiantly warm in the way that creatures are when their metabolism runs hot, and they were still in sleep in the way that creatures are still when they feel entirely safe, and the shop held a deep, contented quiet that was different in quality from the usual after-hours silence. Fuller somehow, less empty. He began to sleep better than he had in years. He did not examine this development closely because examining things too closely was not, in his experience, always useful. Some things worked. This worked. It was, he had to admit, not a bad arrangement. And if he had known in those early weeks before he knew what they were, that somewhere in the mountains above the valley, an elder copper-scaled dragon had stopped eating and was sitting at the entrance to an empty hatchling cavern in the specific stillness of something trying to hold itself together. If he had known that, he would have sent word immediately, because Darrow Finch was not an unreasonable man and had no interest in causing that kind of distress to anyone. But he hadn't known, he'd thought they were lizards. Unusual lizards, granted, but lizards. And then he'd known they weren't lizards, but by then they were Ember and Bellows and Crest and Nettle and Rivet and Clasp and Forge, and they were sleeping on his chest, and it had simply not occurred to him that somewhere above the clouds someone was looking. Found. The descent from Veltharion took Sareth the better part of a morning. She had not been below the mountain passes in 11 years, and she had forgotten, or perhaps had allowed herself to forget, the way the mind smooths over discomforts that are not immediately relevant, how the world changed as the altitude dropped. The air thickened. The clean cold smell of granite and ice and thin sky gave way, incrementally and then all at once, to the dense layered complexity of the valley territories. Wood smoke and turned earth and river water and the green rot sweet smell of forest where things grew and died, and were absorbed and grew again in continuous, undiscriminating cycles. By the time she cleared the final ridge and the valley opened below her, the smell of human settlement had reached her, faint at first, then unmistakable, that particular cocktail of coal and metal and animal and oil, and the sharp chemical undertone of the fuels and lubricants that seemed, in the decades since she had last come this way, to have become significantly more prevalent. She had dispatched Elder Voss and 2 of the younger searching dragons to the other valley settlements to the east and south, with instructions to proceed quietly and to send word rather than act if they found anything. She had taken the western settlements herself, both because she was the enclave's senior elder and it was appropriate, and because she did not trust herself to send someone else and then wait. She had been waiting for 5 weeks. She had reached the end of her capacity for it. The first two villages produced nothing useful. At the first, a cluster of farming homesteads arranged around a grain storage facility. The humans she managed to communicate with had no knowledge of unusual creatures and regarded her with the particular expression of people who are being very careful not to show how frightened they are, which Sareth tried to make easier by keeping her distance and her voice low and her posture as non-threatening as a 30-foot copper dragon could manage. At the second, a larger settlement with a river trading post, an old woman who appeared entirely unbothered by Sareth's presence. Either very brave or very tired, Sareth could not tell which told her that she had heard something from her cousin's husband about strange goings-on at a mechanic's place further west, though she couldn't say exactly what and couldn't say exactly where except that it was one of the smaller villages in that direction, the one with the mill. Sareth had proceeded west. She found the village with the mill at mid-morning, descending from a low-altitude approach that she had calculated would minimize the time between her appearance and her landing. A brief, concentrated alarm rather than the extended period of panic that a slow approach would have produced. She landed in the square because it was the only space large enough to accommodate her safely, folded her wings immediately, and held herself still while the predictable chaos ran its course. Chickens fled in every direction with the complete abandonment of creatures for whom flight was both literal and default. A cart horse sat down with a sound of profound resignation, as though this was simply the next in a long series of indignities, and it had decided to receive it from a position closer to the ground. A dog she had not noticed began barking from behind a fence with the frantic, repetitive energy of something that had decided noise was its only available contribution to the situation. Two adults who had been crossing the square when she landed reverse direction with impressive speed and pressed themselves against the nearest wall. Three small children, however, ran toward her. They came from different directions, which suggested they had not coordinated. This was simply the independent reaction of three separate small humans to the appearance of a large dragon in their village square, and that reaction was apparently enthusiasm. The fastest of the three reached her foreleg before any adult had managed to recover enough to intervene, grabbed the edge of her leg scale with both hands, and looked up at her with an expression of absolute delight. Sareth looked down at the child. The child showed no signs of reconsidering. She noted this with something that, despite everything, approached respect. Whatever else humans were, they produced, in their young, a fearlessness that was either very stupid or very admirable, and the line between those two things was, she had come to believe over 2 centuries, considerably thinner than most species assumed. The adults had begun to recover. One man, broad-shouldered, practical-looking, the kind of human whose clothing was permanently marked by whatever work he did, came forward with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who was frightened, but had decided that being frightened was less important than the thing that needed doing. He detached the child from her leg with a firm but gentle efficiency that suggested practice, and then looked up at her with the direct, assessing gaze of a person who was rapidly recalibrating their expectations for the day. Sareth asked, keeping her voice as low and unthreatening as she could manage given its fundamental quality, whether any of them had seen unusual creatures in the area. Small ones, scaled. She described the 7 as specifically as she could. The humans exchanged glances with each other in the rapid, subtle way that communities did when they were deciding collectively how to respond to something. Then the practical-looking man pointed toward the edge of town. He said something about a mechanic. He gave a name, Finch, she retained, and a direction. She thanked them, which produced a second round of recalibration in their expressions, and went where they had pointed. She approached the building carefully. It was small and low by any standard, constructed from timber and corrugated iron in the utilitarian way of working buildings, built for function rather than appearance, every element chosen for what it did rather than what it looked like. The corrugated iron roof caught the mid-morning light in dull, irregular reflections. The yard around it was occupied by machinery in various states, a hauler with its side panel removed, 2 smaller vehicles she didn't have a name for, a collection of metal components arranged in piles that she suspected had an organizational logic invisible to her. Everything was dirty in the specific way of things that were actively used rather than neglected. There was a distinction she had observed over centuries of watching humans work between the dirt of disuse and the dirt of function. This was the latter. The great bay door was open. From inside, she could hear the rhythmic clank of someone working, a measured, deliberate sound. The sound of a specific tool being applied to a specific problem, with the patience of someone who had done this kind of thing enough times that they did not need to rush it. She could also smell the hatchlings. She had not expected that the smell would reach her before the sight, that she would know before she looked, that 5 weeks of not knowing would end not with a dramatic visual confirmation but with a smell, with the particular warm mineral sulfur scent of young dragons that she knew as thoroughly as she knew her own scales, hitting her with a force that was entirely disproportionate to its subtlety. She stopped moving for a moment. She made no sound. Then she folded herself as small as a dragon of her size could reasonably fold, which was not very small in absolute terms, but was a meaningful reduction from her full dimensions, and she looked through the open door. Darrow Finch was lying on a low-wheeled platform, a mechanic's creeper. She did not know the word but could understand the function, beneath the undercarriage of a large hauler, doing something with a wrench that required both hands and a moderate degree of force, judging by the sounds and the slight regular tension in his visible arm. He was working with the unhurried focus of someone entirely absorbed in a task, and he appeared, to all external observation, to be entirely unaware that he was also serving as a sleeping platform for 7 dragon hatchlings. They were arranged across him with the proprietary, weight-distributing confidence of creatures who had been doing this for long enough that it required no conscious negotiation. Bellows, she recognized the slate blue immediately, and the recognition hit her somewhere behind her sternum, was asleep with his snout tucked under the man's chin, his breath visible as a faint cold mist in the slightly warmer air of the shop. The red-gold one, the smallest, was sprawled flat on her back across his sternum with all 4 legs extended at maximum distance from her body, in the specific posture of a creature that had achieved a state of relaxation beyond ordinary sleep, beyond ordinary trust, into something that was almost a kind of boasting about how safe it felt. The others were distributed across his torso and legs in an overlapping configuration that had clearly developed over time, not random, but organized in the unconscious way that sleeping arrangements organize themselves through repeated nights of small adjustments, each creature having found the position that worked best and returned to it until it became the default. Darrow was working around them, not despite them, not struggling against their weight and presence, but around asterisk them, his body and his work having simply incorporated their existence as a fixed condition, like working in a confined space or in poor light, a constraint that had been absorbed and adapted to so thoroughly that it no longer registered as a constraint. He had clearly done this before, many times, enough times that it was ordinary. Sarith was silent for a long moment. The silence was not empty. It was full of 5 weeks of searching, of empty nests, of tracking spells cast at 3-scale cost, of scrying pools that showed only what had been, of the way the enclave had grown quiet, of the careful cushioned tones of the other elders preparing her for the worst. It was full of the morning she had found the nests empty and stood at the cavern entrance for a long time before she called for anyone. It was full of the thought she had not let herself think clearly until Elder Voss had forced her to turn around, that they had gone somewhere on purpose, that they had chosen. She looked at Crest. Crest had always been anxious. She had known this about him from before his hatching, had read it in the frequency of movement within the shell, had recognized it in the first hours after he emerged, a quality of hypervigilance, of constant low-level alertness that was not fear exactly but was the posture of a creature that had decided the world was something to be watched very carefully at all times. In the enclave, he had hidden. He had investigated things from a distance before approaching. He had chosen, consistently and without exception, to sleep in the deepest part of the hatchling cavern, in the corner with the most solid walls on the most sides. She had been working with him gently over the months since his hatching, trying to build the foundation of ease that would eventually, she had hoped, allow him to relax. Crest was lying in a shaft of sunlight in the middle of the shop floor, on his back, completely visible from every direction. His eyes were half open in the specific way of creatures in that particular state between sleep and wakefulness that required, as a biological precondition, the feeling of being entirely safe. His copper scales caught the light in a way that would have been, to any predator, immediately attention-drawing. There was nothing concealed about his position, nothing strategic. He was simply there in the light, warm and visible, and apparently unbothered by either of those things. She looked at him for a long time. Then Crest lifted his head, turned it, and looked directly at her with bright amber eyes. There was recognition in the look, she was certain of it, certain he knew who she was, and there was something else in it too, something she needed a moment to name. He was not frightened of her, he was not anxious. He looked at her with the calm, assessing gaze of a creature that was at ease in its circumstances and was simply nodding a new development, and then he put his head back down. Darrow rolled out from under the haulers. He emerged feet first, then legs, then torso, with the unhurried efficiency of someone completing a task before addressing the next one. He turned his head, saw her, and went still for a moment, not the frozen stillness of fear but the brief stillness of rapid, practical assessment. He sat up slowly and carefully, clearly conscious of the sleeping hatchlings, with the controlled movement of someone who had spent considerable time learning how to move without disturbing a specific arrangement of small, heavy bodies. Several of them grumbled anyway. Bellows relocated his snout from the man's chin to his knee with a muttered sound that required no translation. Forge, the large dark blue-black one, opened one eye, evaluated the situation, and closed it again. Darrow looked at her over the remaining sleepers distributed across his lap. His expression was readable in the way that direct, uncomplicated people's expressions were readable. He was thinking, and he had not yet finished thinking, and he was not going to say anything until he had. Yours, he asked. They belong to the Enclave, yes, Sareth said. She was maintaining careful control of her voice. This required more effort than she would have predicted. She was looking at 7 hatchlings who were alive, healthy, and apparently so profoundly comfortable in their current circumstances that none of them had woken up for a dragon landing in the doorway. And she found that this, the completeness of it, the sheer, ordinary, warm, alive completeness of them asleep on a human mechanic's lap, was doing something complicated to the composure she had been maintaining for 5 weeks. We have been searching for nearly 5 weeks, she said. Darrow looked down at Ember, who had not woken and showed no signs of waking. Her red-gold scales rose and fell with the slow rhythm of deep sleep. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is reviewing events rather than constructing an argument. They wandered in about a month ago, he said. Fed 'em they stayed. A pause, they're good company. It was said without decoration, without the self-consciousness that many humans brought to statements they thought might be judged. It was simply true, in the flat, unambiguous way that practical people stated things that were true. She noted the care with which he was sitting, the small, constant adjustments of a person maintaining a position for someone else's comfort rather than their own. She studied him properly for the first time, with the comprehensive attention she had been holding back while she managed her own internal response to the scene. He was middle-aged by human reckoning, which was a relatively young category by hers. The decades had settled into him in the way they settled into people who worked physically, giving him a solidity that was both muscular and textural, the calloused, worn, well-used quality of hands and face that spent their time in direct contact with material reality. He was not by any visible measure remarkable. He was not powerful in any sense she could identify. He had no magic, obviously, she would have detected that immediately. He had no training in dragon rearing or dragon handling or any of the specialized knowledge that the Enclave's own caretakers developed over years of formal study. He had no particular authority, no status that she could identify, no quality that would have distinguished him in a crowd. He had apparently fed them when they were thin and cold, built them a place to sleep so they would be warm, learned which of them breathed what and adjusted his environment accordingly, and given each of them a name. He had been steady, warm, consistent, present. Hatchlings she had known for 2 centuries were not complicated in their core needs beneath all the specific management that their specific natures required. They required safety, the felt sense of it, not the logical fact of it. They required warmth. They required the reliable presence of something larger than themselves that did not leave. That was there in the morning the same as it had been the night before. That could be predicted and returned to and trusted as a fixed point, while the complicated and overwhelming business of being a new creature in a large world proceeded around them. She thought about what the Enclave had provided versus what this had. The Enclave had provided safety, warmth, presence, had provided all the formal requirements, correctly and with expertise and genuine care. But the Enclave was also large and loud and full of adult dragons conducting the business of a community, and Crest had hidden in corners, and the tracking spells had been cast at 3-scale cost, and they had searched for 5 weeks and found nothing because the 7 had not gone further up but further down, through the mountain passes, into the valley territories. Into this low-ceilinged timber and corrugated iron building that smelled of oil and smoke and work, and a human who apparently went to sleep surrounded by small warm creatures, and did not see any particular reason to find this remarkable. She thought about what it said that this was where they had come, what it said about what they had needed that they had not quite been getting. She would think about that more carefully later, and it would be a difficult and important thought, but later. We will need to discuss their return, she said. Darrow said suppose so, in the tone of someone who found this reasonable. He reached over and scratched Bellows gently behind the jaw ridge with the automatic ease of someone who had done this specific thing enough times that it required no attention. Bellows produced a sound from somewhere deep in his chest, a rumbling, resonant sound like a very small avalanche that decided midway through that it was not going to commit to being an avalanche after all. Sareth watched that. She thought about the empty nests. She thought about Crest in the sunlight. She thought about 5 weeks and 3 scales and a year of sleep per dragon and the scrying pools showing only what had been. She thought about the avalanche sound and the way Darrow had made it without looking, the way people touched familiar things without looking. She had come here to take them home. She was standing in a doorway looking at 7 hatchlings who were home. These were not the same thing, and she was old enough and honest enough to know that they were not the same thing, and what she did with that knowledge in the next few minutes was going to matter. She thought about Crest on his back in the sunlight. She thought about it with the specific, precise attention of someone examining evidence and following it to its conclusion regardless of where the conclusion led. Then she said, the Enclave has never had a formal liaison to the human settlements. Darrow looked up at her. His expression shifted from the thoughtful blankness of someone listening to the particular alertness of someone who is now paying attention to something different. It is a salaried position, she continued, and she could hear in her own voice the slight quality of someone constructing policy while speaking it aloud, finding the shape of a thing in real time, which was not how she preferred to work but which was occasionally how things needed to work. The role would involve regular communication between the Enclave and the Valley territories, trade relationships, diplomatic groundwork, practical liaison on matters affecting both communities. She paused. It would require a workshop. The Enclave has space and materials and more broken machinery than you would perhaps expect from a community of dragons. Another pause. Proximity to hatchlings would be unavoidable. Darrow Finch was quiet for a moment. He looked around his shop, the hauler with its panel off, the organized scrap piles, the sleeping platform built from engine casing near the stove, the tools hung in their specific places on the board above the workbench, 30 years of accumulated practice embedded in the arrangement of a working life. He looked at the bay door open onto the village street where people were, she suspected, engaged in the careful not-looking of humans trying to give a situation room to resolve itself. He looked at the 7 hatchlings distributed across him with the comfortable certainty of creatures that did not question whether they were where they were supposed to be. His face was doing the thing again, the internal review, the practical assessment. She waited because she had been alive for 2 centuries and knew that some things needed to be waited for. "I'd need to bring my tools," he said. There was a long pause in which Sareth considered what she had just agreed to, what the Enclave would say, what Elder Voss would say, what 200 years of precedent said about humans taking up residence in dragon enclaves, and how much she cared about any of that relative to Crest on his back in the sunlight. "Obviously," she said. The hatchling slept through the entire negotiation. Ember did not move. Bellows resettled his snout against Darrow's knee and breathed a small contented cloud of cold mist into the warm shop air. Forge kept one eye closed and one eye open in the specific half-vigilance of a creature that was not concerned but was not entirely off-duty either. Watching Sareth with an amber gaze that was, she realized with a start, assessing her with the same calm, methodical attention that she had just been applying to Darrow. She met Forge's eye. Forge regarded her for a moment longer, then closed the second eye. "Cleared, apparently." Outside, she could hear the village resuming around them. The cart horse had gotten up from the sound of it, and the dog had stopped barking. And the ordinary sounds of a mid-morning in a working settlement had re-established themselves with the resilient mundanity of daily life continuing in the presence of extraordinary things. Inside the shop, the stove ticked softly. A shaft of light had moved across the floor and was now falling across the edge of the sleeping platform. And Nettle, the small, iridescent green one, she had identified them all now, could not help it, kept matching the descriptions Darrow had given, and the qualities she recognized had shifted in her sleep to follow it without waking. Sareth looked at all of it for a moment longer. She thought that she would send word to Elder Voss. She thought that there would be considerable discussion at the next council, and that some of it would be difficult, and that the precedent they were establishing today was one that would take years to fully understand the implications of. She thought about the hatchling cavern with its empty nests, and about how she would need to think carefully about what those nests had been missing and whether the Enclave could provide it differently, and about Crest, who had never chosen to sleep somewhere visible until a human mechanic's shop floor in a shaft of afternoon light. She thought that she had come down the mountain expecting to bring 7 hatchlings home, and she was going home with something more complicated and more important than that. She looked at Darrow, who was looking at her with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who had accepted the shape of what was going to happen, and was simply waiting for the logistics to catch up. "We leave in 3 days," she said. "That should give you time to arrange what needs arranging." 2 days, said Darrow. "I've got a transmission job I can finish by tomorrow afternoon, and I don't like leaving things half done." Sareth considered this. 2 days, she agreed. Ember slept on, red gold and radiantly warm, entirely unconcerned with arrangements. The sunlight moved across the floor of the shop in its slow, indifferent arc, and somewhere above the clouds, the Enclave's hatchling cavern sat with its 7 empty nests and its accumulated silence, waiting to learn what it meant to bring someone home.